Hi there, I am Harvey Shuffling, and this presentation is about seagrass beds, or also known as seagrass meadows. They are one of the least well known, but some of the most important ecosystems that are threatened right now. So, regarding the topics that we've covered in class, it this presentation is mostly about ecosystem sustainability, um, mainly off of the southeast coast of the U.S., but it does span up as far as Virginia, and they are also prevalent on many other continents. It's also important to bring up that fishery management can play a big role in the conservation and restoration of the seagrass meadows, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So it's important to understand what seagrasses are if we're going to try and conserve them and restore them. They are actually more closely related to flowering plants, angiosperms, than they are to algae. So they produce seeds, flowers, and possess a vascular system, but they do not have a stomata, which is they're effectively cells that allow plants to take in CO2 and, um, and release oxygen. Now, they are monocots, which means they are closely related to grasses, lilies, palms, and you could actually say they're more closely related to the corn that we grow and eat on a regular basis than they are to algae. So the way that they reproduce can be either sexually or asexually, which can have a big effect on how we can restore them or maintain them. Regarding asexual reproduction, some entire meadows can form from a single plant. Actually, the oldest organism on the planet is a seagrass meadow that came from a single plant that is almost 200,000 years old. Now, they can rely on sexual reproduction via pollination. This is facilitated by plants and some microorganisms, and this helps with diversification and preventing genes from alleles kind of peaking in one direction and then mutations occur. So it does help with diversity and the survivability of the species. So some of these meadows that are formed can be formed from a single plant in under a year, which is highly beneficial regarding restoration and reimplementation of these because it can take a minimal effort if the conditions are right for these plants to just spread out and effectively create a new ecosystem. Others can take hundreds of years to form one of these fully functioning meadows. Um, of course, this is going to affect restoration efforts in that the species that are able to reproduce at that very quick rate are going to have a much better shot at, regarding restoration and surviving and thriving as opposed to those that can take hundreds of years. Now, regarding the ecology of seagrasses, there are 72 species alive today. They're spread over four major groups, and they evolved roughly 100 million years ago. This makes them older than a lot of the dinosaurs, and actually means that they survived the KP event, so the Great Extinction 65 million years ago that wiped the dinosaurs out. I mean, this can tell you that they are pretty resilient as far as organisms go. Not a whole lot made it through that extinction, um, which is why it makes it even more concerning that they're threatened now. We can kind of see the juxtaposition there. Now, they're most commonly found in shallow waters where light can penetrate as they photosynthesize. All plants that photosynthesize, you're going to need sunlight. That being said, some can actually live as far as 200 feet down. They don't require as much, but this can also affect restoration efforts, just depending on the conditions. Sunnier areas, the species that are more prone to be in these sunny areas is going to be good, but with rising ocean levels, some of the ones that live farther down may have the advantage. So they're considered ecosystem engineers. It means that where seagrasses thrive, they change the surrounding environment and they create these unique ecosystems that are extraordinarily diverse. I mean, we're talking hundreds of different organisms, many of which are endangered. For example, manatees, you know, they're basically considered sea cows because they eat seagrass. You know, you've got your turtles, you've got microorganisms, there's large vertebrates, and they are considered nurseries for a lot of different organisms. So many fish will come here to lay their eggs in the protection of the seagrass beds, and because they're full of nutrients and it offers some protection from bigger predators. And of course, these predators, knowing that these seagrass beds are full of fish, they're going to be prime hunting grounds. These predators include humans as well. Again, more on that later. You could effectively consider these ecosystems as pastures, so to speak, on land. So, you know, where you have some of these grasses, you're going to have you're going to have smaller organisms, the larger ones that prey on them, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the big things is that they are massive carbon sequesters. They take in a ton of CO2, and what they do is they store it in their roots. So these roots are embedded on the or in the ocean floor, and it's considered blue carbon. And effectively, it's a lot less prone to erosion or being pulled up. Uh, it's a carbon sink that's going to last a lot longer than, say, your traditional terrestrial plant. So going on to ecological services, in addition to that, the biodiversity concentration of these beds, they're super big hotspots for fishing. This is where fishery management comes in. They're also extremely intrinsically valuable. We're talking a hectare being worth around $19,000 a year, just given that they help prevent coastline erosion. They can help prevent against storms. They offer a buffer for that. And then, I mean, just the amount of fish that are caught in some of these areas. Now, one of the issues that seagrasses face is that they have a 1.5% loss of each year. Roughly 30% of all the seagrasses have died off in the last century. Again, these are plants that lived through the Cretaceous extinction. Nearly a quarter of all the seagrass species are considered threatened or endangered, and the meadows that develop are, again, if they develop slowly, they are especially vulnerable. So losing some of these effects or losing some of these seagrasses can have drastic effects that reach far beyond just losing the grasses themselves. I mean, it's again, some of these threatened species, the endangered species that are there, that rely on them, you know, no seagrasses, you know, no manatees, and so on and so forth. You know, there's a lot of species. They are at the base of the trophic level in the ecosystems that they help create. So when you take out that base, you are effectively taking out everything that directly relies on them. You also lose that huge carbon sink. This is so effective. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 3 or 4 thousand miles from the average car emissions that a single car will put out in a year. Um, 1 hectare can pull that out, and that is massive. You know, just think about how, you know, if you think about how widespread these are, you know, the more seagrass beds, you know, the better of a CO2 counter for the atmosphere that we have. It also has a big impact on oxygen production. This is something that I'm sure as humans we're all concerned about, you know, directly for us and for everything that relies on oxygen. So, you know, many terrestrial species, almost all of them. And then it also is going to impact fisheries and the commodities produced from seagrasses. It sounds weird, but I mean, they have used seagrasses to make mattresses. They've used them for quite a few different things, things that wouldn't even occur without researching them. So a lot of the main threats, um, well, we can start with some of the minor ones first. Storms and wave action are always going to be potential threats. If you've got a hurricane in these areas, and hurricanes, again, if we're looking at The Southeast Atlantic, right off the coast of the US, we know that they are no strangers to hurricanes. There is a wasting disease that's around that prevents photosynthesis. Of course, with any organism, the healthier organisms are going to survive this wasting disease a little bit better. But again, what ends up happening is we start losing diversity. The big one is the anthropomorphic causes, so what people are doing. This is in many forms, and we're going to touch on that in just a second. But a combination of each one of these factors, say you have bigger storms and more wave action in an area, that's going to create weaker plants that are more susceptible to disease, and then everything else that people are doing to them, both directly and indirectly. So again, we said human activity is there's a variety of things that will destroy this. You've got fishing, industrial runoff, pollution, and invasive species. Um, so, for example, with fishing, if you're dragging nets along the ground, you're going to be pulling up a lot of these grasses. You're going to be destroying these meadows because the way that they do this is they weight nets down and they drag across the seafloor to catch anything and everything that they can. This also eliminates organisms that help maintain the seagrasses, um, as well as even just your traditional fishing. If you're taking out some of the organisms that help maintain the seagrasses, they're not going to be as healthy and they are more susceptible to everything else. Of course, industrial runoff in a lot of these areas is going to be extremely detrimental. Some of the chemicals that are pushed out from the factories around there, they can either annihilate or severely weaken them, again, making them more susceptible. And then again, touching on some of the organisms that help maintain these meadows, um, one of the biggest invasive species that we have been trying to combat are lionfish. And from what I understand, lionfish were actually introduced by somebody keeping a few as a pet, and they were released out into an environment that had no way to counteract them. I mean, there are some sharks, but again, with fishing, people are pulling sharks out of these areas like crazy, both private and commercial. So the lionfish are just going crazy in these seagrass meadows, and they're losing the organisms that maintain them. Think like if we lost our honeybees, what would happen to all the flowering plants? So there are a lot of management efforts that have been kicked into gear more recently. Um, the problem is that there aren't any international laws that protect them. So varying from state to state, the effectiveness is going to change. Certain states have much more stringent laws on some of these things versus others. Um, Most of these efforts are actually focused more on the animals, but of course, if you don't protect the seagrasses, then we're not really protecting the animals very well. So what we've seen is that people are actually going and reseeding them by hand. Of course, this is very time intensive, which is what brings into effect the ones that can reproduce faster and create meadows. Those are going to be the ones that are more effective to be reseeded. Again, this does lower species diversity. There are also external factors as well. You're looking at the industrial runoff in certain areas, and this can spread to other places, which is why an prohibited international sanctions would be much better. It's very possible for them to recover, which is nice. There is good news. They can come back, but we have to take proper steps. So we saw in Virginia, there were a lot of efforts over the last 20 years that restored 3,600 hectares. And yeah, I mean, it shows that these efforts are not being wasted on anything. Of course, tighter restrictions on boating, as you can see, the boating trails from some of these ships, or well, smaller boats, I guess, they are just tearing these things apart. Redoubled efforts to reseed the meadows. It's already shown to work, especially in Virginia. And then tighter restrictions on industrial runoff. These are all of my references, images on the bottom, and then the information on the top. Thank you very much for your time, and take care.